Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our next online event in the Interactive Entertainment Law Review series. Tonight, we are here to celebrate the upcoming issue 4.1 that we decided to entirely dedicate to the issue of monetization mechanisms and practices such as loot boxes in the context of the video game industry. And we are looking at this heavily discussed issue from different perspectives, from different approaches and different jurisdictions. We are here tonight to present to you an article which features as an advanced access article for the journal, which is something that we are introducing with this upcoming issue. So our readers and our audience has a chance to access a selected piece prior to the publication of the whole issue. For the 4.1, we have selected the following title: Getting Under Your Skins, a legal ethical exploration of Fortnite's transformation into a content delivery platform and its manipulative potential. And we are welcoming here tonight the authors, which are Marin Sachs and Jeff Ausloos from University of Amsterdam. I hope I've managed to pronounce your names as close as to how they actually sound in Dutch. We also welcome here tonight Dr. Yin Hearn Lee and Professor John Festninger as commentators and panelists, and I will be hosting tonight's event. Both Marin and Jeff, as I said, are based at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam as postdocs. Marin has a background in political science and philosophy, and his dissertation between empowerment and manipulation, the ethics and regulation of for-profit health apps, combines ethical and legal approaches, which is something that's also explored in the article. He is part of an interdisciplinary project at the moment that looks at diversity in algorithmic news recommenders. Jeff, in addition to being based at the Institute for Information Law, is also a research fellow at the University of Leuven. He has done extensive work on the theoretical and practical dimension of data rights within GDPR. And his current work centers around the role of law in putting in operation meaningful transparency of digital infrastructures. His book, The Right to Erasure in EU Data Protection Law, From Individual Rights to Effective Protection, has been published with Oxford University Press last year. Moving on to our commentators, Dr. Yin Hearn Lee is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. Her most recent projects deal with the status of video game modifications under copyright law and the challenges presented by copyright law for the preservation of video games by cultural heritage institutions. She also has an interest in private law remedies, and in particular on the role of intellectual property disputes in remedial innovation. And last but not least, we welcome Professor John Festninger tonight, who is both counsel and educator based in Canada at UBC, where he has taught a wide array of subjects over more than 25 years. He is also a member of the Center for Digital Media. He published the first edition of Video Game Law in 2005 and the second one in 2012, I believe. And his current research interests relate to the relationship between concept of justice and evolving technologies. In particular, the impact of law and regulation on creative endeavors, intersections of copyright fair dealing with freedom of expression, particularly regarding video game mods, the right to freedom of thought in virtually real environments, and digital ethics. Thank you all for being here tonight. Before I hand over to the authors to summarize the main points of the article, I would like to invite our audience to use the chat function to discuss and pose any issues or ideas that they may have throughout the session. And you can also use the Q&A function to pose specific questions to any of the panelists tonight. And we will have the opportunity towards the end of the session to answer those. I believe you can also upvote any questions that you think are most relevant. So now, please, the floor is yours, Marvin and Jeff. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for having us. I will just use like 5 minutes to briefly say something about the paper and how it came about and what we try to do to leave enough time for discussion. So this is one of those papers that actually literally started at a coffee machine. With Jeff at the coffee machine showed me an article about Fortnite. I don't even remember the name of the article, I don't remember the venue, but he showed me an article about where the main argument was Fortnite is turning into a content delivery platform. It's no longer just a video game, it's a content delivery platform. And this idea, this concept spoke to both of us because I'm by training a philosopher and Jeff is a lawyer, and it tickled us both. And it started out with just like a short position paper or a white paper, or whatever you want to call it, and then it basically escalated into a side project that became an actual journal article. And now here we are here. And so the idea of Fortnite turning into a content delivery platform was very interesting to us, because what we saw, what we see in Fortnite is that the game itself seems to become a platform that can be used to offer to its players things that are not necessarily linked to the video game or that aren't part of the video game. So there's movie trailers that are being presented to players. There's the music concerts that have been written about. And we can also see in the future that the platform, as also the developers of the platform explained, can become even more flexible to include even more possibilities for including third-party content and services within the gaming platform. And so this spoke to us because we also thought it was a good way of going beyond many of the articles that were already written about bit old school perspective. Oh my God, video games are so addictive. I mean, my parents said this to me 20 years ago while I was in my room not making my homework. It was kind of true then, it's still kind of true now, but we felt that the content delivery platform aspect brings something new that basically comes on top of the oh my God, video games are so addictive perspective. And so I've been working as a philosopher, as an ethicist, on trying to make sense of this idea of manipulation that you hear a lot about these days. The idea that digital choice environments become increasingly good at understanding our behavior and maybe steering or influencing our behavior. And there seems to be increased attention for the term manipulation to make sense of that phenomenon. And so in the article, we try to use a somewhat technical, ethical definition of manipulation to see whether it can help us make sense of both this general tendency of choice architecture to become increasingly good at understanding and steering our behavior, and also Fortnite in particular, where the Fortnite as a content delivery platform can also maybe be seen as a manifestation of that larger movement. And so in the article, we try to explain basically how Fortnite and the choice architecture it offers to its players functions, and we try to use the ethical concept of manipulation to suggest that maybe there are some worries there that we want to address. And in the last part, and this is where I hand it over to Jeff for a minute or two, we also try to argue that if you actually combine perspectives from data protection law, and most notably, of course, the GDPR, and from consumer law, most notably the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, there's also quite some material there that you can maybe use to address at least part of the manipulative potential that we see in Fortnite.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add to that. Thanks, Marijn, and thanks also to the editors for having us. So yeah, building on what Marijn was saying, I think as a lawyer, you know, we're confronted with these complex, you know, opaque, dynamic digital infrastructures that are constantly adjusting environments based on these constant data flows, and we're finding it very hard, not just as consumers, as users, but also, you know, authority, civil society more broadly. It's very hard to understand how they affect us, and it's also very hard to capture these practices in legal terms. So especially, and this is what we really dig into in the paper as well, this concept of fairness, which is quite central in data protection and consumer protection law, is quite broad and vague and hard to capture. And of course, that has its reasons. It allows for some flexibility and some level of technological neutrality, if you will. But on the other hand, of course, in practice, this is often then this often doesn't need too much enforcement, especially in relation, you know, to very powerful actors. And so perhaps like one last point in general about the paper, we tried to be a bit more exploratory and opening up some avenues for further critical inquiry, if you will. So some of the questions or statements that we raise in the paper have already proven to be a bit provocative to some, but I guess that was exactly the point of what we wanted to achieve. You know, to really start thinking more holistically about these digital infrastructures and how they affect, you know, autonomy and how what the role of transparency is in these environments, and what role, of course, the law can play or should play in this arena. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to discuss with you.
Thank you both for that really useful summary. What I would like to do is to step back a little bit, sort of look at it from a slightly higher level, and make the following statement. We are entrenched in a system that rewards the platform or the channel of communication rather than the content itself. And I think that kind of rings very true to what you are discussing in your article, that to some extent we are seeing a growing gap between what the game should be about, what perhaps the users want the game to be about, to focus and manifestation of wide range of business models and ubiquitous monetization practices, including loot boxes. So I think what you are describing is part of much wider set of systemic and structural issues that are part of this shift, this change from games as products to games as service. How do you feel about this statement? Do you think that, do you agree with it? Do you think that links to or explains monetization practices and loot boxes in particular as a direct consequence of this shift?
Do you want to start, Chef, or should I? Okay. I think this is basically right on the money. So this is, I think, what we can see happening in the gaming industry. So there are many actually like games that I loved as a child, like Age of Empires 1 and 2, also number 3. And I think last week or this week they announced Age of Empires 4, and they showed some first exclusive footage. And for basically all the games that you loved as a child and that are being redeveloped now or being re-released now, you see that they basically try to adopt a freemium model, but for a paid game. So you can buy the new Age of Empires 4 for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 euros. But they've also already said that there's going to be future updates where you can buy new factions and new campaigns. And so another example could be the inevitable console war 4.0, 5.0 between the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, where you also see that especially Microsoft with its Xbox is really hammering down on the idea that there's this Game Pass where the Xbox becomes a platform. You have a monthly subscription fee, and that gives you access to a wide range of video games if you stay with their platform. So they're really trying to build this platform effect to hopefully this time win this round of the so-called console wars. And I think for many games that are being released now, also the big blockbusters like Age of Empires, they are basically trying to adopt a freemium game model while also being paid for games that you pay for.
Jeff, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, not much, to be honest. I think there's a clear trend, like for sustained relevance of these big games, and to be honest, like between the time that we wrote the paper and now, you already see like the popularity of Fortnite decreasing a bit, but this doesn't, I have to say, reduce the relevance of our paper, of course, because we're describing trends, and we're of course using just Fortnite as a clear example at the time. And like you see this sustained relevance that they want to achieve through reaching out to all kinds of different types of mediums. And so I was just checking the latest on Fortnite, and apparently they also just recently integrated with House Party, this also new social media app, to make it easier to live stream there. Yeah, and of course, this whole freemium business model that we go into depth also in the paper really sets these very strong incentives, of course, to capitalize on this real-time monitoring of gamers, basically, and using that to their economic advantage.
Thank you. Yin Hearn, I wanted to ask, what does this shift to games as service model mean for you? Where do you see the main consequences of this changing paradigm, and how it impacts on the function, the core of the game, how it functions, and the gameplay itself, and therefore the user experience ultimately?
So, to absolutely no one's surprise, I'm going to talk about modding. So first of all, I feel that games have always had a tendency not to be entirely self-contained products, because even when they were still being sold on discs, you had things like expansion packs that added on to an existing game. Because I mean, you can do that because it's got a code base, and you can make adjustments like that. And now I think this is something similar taken to 11. And I think from the perspective of modding, which is obviously a great source of player creativity, we know lots of developers who have, I personally know one developer who got his start modding. He was the admin of my mod community, and now he's in charge, and his studio just made the remake of the game that we were modding about 15 years ago. So it's been a great source of player creativity and a great source of talent for the video game industry. And one thing that does concern me is that modding, which used to be seen as unproblematic from an economic point of view, is now potentially seen as being in conflict with contemporary monetization techniques. Because let's take an example at completely random. Let's take the phenomenon of downloadable content. If you're a games company that is selling a standalone product, you sell the game, you don't care what people do with it as long as they bought the game in the first place. That incentivizes you to encourage modding, or at least to leave it alone, because people have already paid you what you are asking for. But if your model is based on selling people add-ons for the same game, then allowing players to create potentially competing add-ons, that causes problems for you from an economic perspective. So to name no names whatsoever, let's say you're selling an overpriced piece of DLC, downloadable content for horse armor, and you don't want your players coming along and making better free versions of horse armor. So I have named no names in this exercise. So to me, that seems to create an incentive for games companies to do what they have traditionally never done, which is push back against modding. And I think you are beginning to see some of this, especially in games that have an online component, which is monetized in a continuous fashion, and then an offline model. And then you see players trying to make mods for the offline version, partly out of an ethical sense, they don't want to interfere with the online version, and partly because they don't want to attract any negative attention for the publisher. But nevertheless, the publisher recognizes that the mods could potentially affect the online version as well if used by less ethical players, and so they clamp down on the whole operation. And that seems to me to be very negative in terms of allowing greater player creativity and greater player expression. So to me, this, from that perspective, I think these contemporary forms of monetization are a bit worrying from that perspective.
Thank you very much. I have a next question for John. Thinking about the introduction and development of monetization practices that have frankly exploded with the changing business model and the shift to games as services. Why has it taken the industry so long to realize that there is something fundamentally wrong with loot boxes? What do you think?
So I will maybe give a bit of a historical perspective on this as briefly as I possibly can. So stage one, 1990s, games are essentially self-contained units. Eventually we get practical multiplayer, and we get developers worrying a little bit about how gamers will treat each other, but not hugely. And a mythology evolves around something called the magic circle that says, you know, law should not intercede in virtual worlds and should not intercede in gaming. And Mia Consalvo, a Canadian academic from Montreal at Concordia University, sort of blew that up in the mid-2000s in a wonderful article called "There Is No Magic Circle." But that was the prevailing mythology, and that mythology even lasted into the 2010s, lasted for a very long time. We're only really shedding it now. But where law started intervening in a genuine way was around the first wave of monetization, when, you know, you could no longer ignore that there were actual commercial contracts taking place, and that the virtual world was not a separate universe with its own flag, its own territory, and its own identity, that there were national laws, you know, largely around monetary instruments that at least had to come into play, if not significantly more. So that was sort of phase one, and it was around monetization itself. Now we're in this new world of platformization. And so I think the consequences, as Jeff and Marjan have talked about, are a little bit different and actually much more three-dimensional. And it's not just affecting gaming platforms. You're seeing some of the same issues in being dealt with by Facebook and Google and Twitter. These sort of larger three-dimensional issues that involve what's happening. If you have a platform, what's actually happening on your platform to the real people who are using it. So at this point, you know, although the issue of kids and monetization has always been around, we now have kids and loot boxes as the potential proxy for gambling and real social issues. And at the same time, and we've seen this, I think Facebook's the clearest example, you have those who own the platforms taking this journey, which is a very interesting journey from a philosophical perspective, and I'm not the philosopher here, from hey, you know, fans, people, this is a place you come to in order to exercise your freedom, to no, there are rules that apply and we, the platform, will apply them. So if there's cheating or if there's fraud, they're within, you know, our structure, they're contractual, to this third phase where sort of extra legal norms start applying to what Facebook is doing now, where they've set up essentially a quasi-judicial body that, you know, that is an appeal where essentially they're acting as a court, and legal matters are decided within the platform. Within video game companies, they haven't gone that far yet, but I think this is the journey we're on. And ultimately, the thing about loot boxes that's, I think, beyond doubt is that if the industry doesn't fully deal with the law and norms within the platform, governments have expressed, let's say, more than a willingness, an interest, whether that's appropriate or not, in engaging in that sort of regulation. So I think that's the historical context, and hopefully answers your question, Michaela.
Thanks, John. Back on that, my next question is to the authors again. Looking at the existing microtransactions and different business models, some of which can be described as loot boxes, some of which go beyond that particular definition, even there isn't any fixed general definition of what loot box is. And I think we can expect that while loot boxes may be retired and replaced by something else, monetization practices are here to stay. Different kind of microtransactions are here to stay, as we are pretty much sort of settling into this concept of games as service. From your perspective, from the ethical and legal approach that you've adopted in your paper, where do you think you can draw the line between microtransactions that are an acceptable part of the game experience and where we are moving into a very dangerous and shady area? Or do you think that is even possible?
Do you want to start, Chef, or?
I mean, yeah, sure. I'll let you think for a bit, because I also have to think a bit, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, my intuitive answer also would be, you know, the practice. You see this trend of practices that are really aimed at pushing for microtransactions right in the middle of the action, right? So not before you start up the game, you know, it's like an entry through the gift shop, you know, like which cool armor can I buy, blah de blah. That seems still okay to some extent, but you know, these other practices where, you know, you're almost out of ammo, for instance, in a shooting game, and it's like, oh, buy, you know, like buy this much bullet for this price, etc., etc. I mean, there it becomes a bit more tricky, I guess. I find it very hard to put like a generic, you know, like this is where to draw the line, because it will often depend, you know, on this broader context. That's also the point of the paper, right? It's not these individual instances. It often depends on this broader, you know, ecosystem. But I'd say, like, really, these microtransactions that target players at moments that we can generally expect to be, you know, where their guards are really lowered the most, which is, you know, really during the gameplay, during in these hyper engaging environments. That's where it really becomes. That's where I would draw the line, I guess, if you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, I think I largely or completely agree with Chef. So I think one thing that really strikes me about the way Fortnite tries to build a content delivery platform is that it seems to be very deliberately what I take to be the intentions of the builders of the environment. They want native integration of many of the advertising-like events they are running within the very gaming experience. And that to me seems to be a move that is deliberately aimed at trying to get players at the moment they are least able to basically resist. So for instance, with the in-game events for the new Star Wars movie. So at a somewhat random moment, literally within the gameplay, without any loading screen whatsoever, within the very same gaming experience, you started looking at a partly scripted Star Wars event that then basically forced you to watch a virtual stage where you had to watch the avatars of J.J. Abrams and some other guy, I think, giving a somewhat cringy interview about the new Star Wars movie, and then they started the new Star Wars trailer. So as a player, you literally had to basically pull the plug of your entire PC to remove yourself from that situation because they got you right when you were in the action. That to me comes pretty close to crossing a line, and it's this like native integration that seems to be also very attractive, because we know from many studies from computer science that native advertising, it just works very well because people are incredibly bad at recognizing it, and this is what I have quite some problems with.
And just to quickly add to that, a point we raised in the paper, which is problematic from a legal perspective, is this, to what extent do the example that Marijn just mentioned of this native integration, to what extent does that comply with the identification principle, you know, which is quite central in EU advertisement rules, that it always has to be clear that certain content is in fact an ad, and from what we've seen, it's not clear at all, you know, it's not clearly communicated at all in this in Fortnite.
Thank you both. Just kind of checking the questions and comments from the audience. So we have two comments from Mayank, which are, I think, relevant at this stage. The one is that manipulative monetization would be when the player is restricted from playing the game with all its intended mechanics. That is a kind of aggression which should receive backlash. So I guess that might be sort of encompassed in a model where you have to pay in order to play and to win, pretty much, where purchasing various items gives you a competitive advantage that you can't achieve otherwise. And there is a question which I'm going to ask Yin Hearn, whether monetization is a necessary evil, considering how costly it has become to make video games, and how that links to your point on modding.
Well, I don't know very much about finances within the AAA video game industry, but it has occurred to me that the industry seems increasingly risk averse. I mean, they were pretty risk averse before, and now they're even more risk averse. And considering it from a creativity and innovation point, it doesn't seem to me to be a desirable thing to continuously enable this kind of business model. So maybe they should be adopting business model. Sorry, I'm being really mean, but perhaps, you know, it's not incumbent on us as the audience to think of a better business model. It's incumbent on the people profiting from the business to do so. I think there was a question that earlier about monetization of mods, which might be one of the ways that games companies want to do monetization next. And as I think was Mayank again pointing, oh no, was Mitchell pointing out that Valve experimented with this. There was a lot of backlash, and they discontinued the program. I have a number of different thoughts, because to me the backlash seems to be composed of 3 strands. The first strand is the ethics strand, which is, should this kind of gig economy fan labor stuff really be turned into a commodity? Is that a good thing? That's one strand. The second strand seems to be a consumer protection issue. A consumer protection issue, which is about what happens if people start selling substandard mods that don't do what they claim to do and might even damage your game experience or damage your game. And the third strand seems the third strand seems to be a question of provenance, which is the risk that some unscrupulous player is going to download the free mod from somewhere and put it on the platform and sell it. In fact, I've seen examples of this kind of thing happening in other circles. So I don't know whether the solution is a legal one, or whether the solution should be an ethical norm-based one, as John was talking about earlier. And I think it would be interesting to see what people think about this and why they feel a particular way about monetization of mods. And unrelatedly, I just wanted to add, Maran, that your description of the Star Wars event, it reminded me a long time ago of when they would insert sudden advertisements in books. You would be reading a book and then suddenly the hero would get up and make himself a can of soup. And he would talk about what the brand of soup was and how great it was. And those had been inserted in there without the writer's approval. It was entirely a marketing gimmick. So that reminded me very much of that experience. Except that with a book, you can skip ahead to the next page. With that kind of experience, you can't.
Thanks, Yin Hearn. I saw John raising his hand. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 points. In terms of the economic models, Apple Arcade Apple is engaged in a very interesting experiment right now called Arcade, where you pay a monthly fee for your games. It's still platform model. You get a number of games. I've been playing NBA 2K on the Apple Arcade model. There's nothing extra to buy, and it sort of harkens back to the pure non-monetized games that are just games for the sake of games. And it's a very interesting experiment, and we'll see the extent to which it works, and it provides an alternative means. You're never going to get around monetization. How do you create AAA games without charging for them? But it's worth watching this experiment. The other point I just wanted to make is just to remind people, because we're talking about EA and the Star Wars game, and that getting this whole loot box controversy going, that in fact it didn't really start over loot boxes themselves. The controversy initially was that it would take you 27 days of grinding in Battlefront 2, in Star Wars Battlefront 2, in order to unlock the Darth Vader character. And that created so much online controversy that it got some political attention, but it wasn't actually a loot box complaint. Loot boxes became, or the controversy around loot boxes became an answer, a legal and political answer that intervened on that problem and then created its own world and its own controversy. So it is sort of a reminder to everyone how these larger issues become larger issues. That one was initially just a series of player complaints. Nobody was talking about loot boxes, and it was in a beta version of Star Wars Battlefront even. So what I take from that is that the political climate around platforms, for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with games, that have to do with politics and Brexit and the US elections in 2016 and 2020, has become extremely, well, depending on your view, extremely important and powerful, potentially extremely toxic to freedom, potentially extremely and properly protective of freedom of thought and the right of consumers. So, you know, there's a lot in play right now.
And it did lead to the most downvoted comment on Reddit in history, which is also a nice thing. When an EA games developer tried to explain why the Darth Vader grinding loot box was a good idea, and it became literally the most downvoted comment on Reddit. So kudos to EA.
Continuing in this sort of vein of comments, as we were discussing the event yesterday, John mentioned that if anyone noticed the fact that over the last couple of months, there's been virtually no news in relation to loot boxes, monetization practices, or anything of the kind. And it kind of dawned on me that actually with this upcoming 4.1 issue, we are filling this informational and analytical void by giving the audience a snapshot of what is happening in the industry. What are the different responses? What are the different consequences? And perhaps what are the causes behind the issue of what loot boxes have become. And my next question is to all the panelists. What do you think is happening now and what's going to happen next? Are we right now in the eye of the storm? Are we, is this a false sense of calm and things are going to explode, or have we all moved on to something else? Anyone who'd like to take the floor, please.
Well, I'll take a very quick crack at that and then hopefully be provocative enough so that others will want to comment. I think that what we're looking at is a major case of bigger fish to fry. I'll remind everybody that games have always been second or third class, and game developers have always been second or third class citizens in the political firmament. You know, they've been the last ones to get government support for creativity, long behind movies and television and other things in any domestic creative structure. Gamers have always been given short shrift as teenagers in basements. And I think what's happening right now is that the political class and the political Mandarin class looks at gaming very much as the tail end of the issue, and that the issue is very much around Google and Facebook and Twitter, and when we resolve those issues, all those answers will apply to games. And I think the gaming industry has done a terrible job in explaining why it's different and creating a separate track for itself that would allow its own kind of position on freedom of expression, and just hasn't done it. So I think the gaming industry is itself extremely vulnerable and may be fooled by the quiet, thinking, oh, well, it's gone away. It hasn't gone away. We've just gone back as gamers in a gaming industry to being unimportant to the politicians while they figure out the bigger things, and while they're assuming that anything they do there will apply to the gaming industry, which of course would be a disaster for the gaming industry. But our own lack of sophistication on this front arguably is our own fault.
Thanks, John. Anyone wants to pick up on that?
I mean, tangentially related, but I think it's a point that I really want to stress. What is completely untenable, in my opinion, in Marin's opinion as well, I know, is this tendency for games, Epic Games in particular, but also more broadly, these online platforms, to keep on saying we have no way of knowing, what users are in fact children. And if anything, it's quite clear, especially in the gaming context, that significant portions of users are in fact children, and children, as I don't have to tell people here, benefit from additional protections. And it's sort of absurd to me that there hasn't been that much proper enforcement on this yet, and that these companies keep on getting away with it. This is really absurd to me.
I don't think that's tangential at all. I think that's at the core very much of this discussion. And it's a perfect example of what I think gets cleaned up in the Facebook, Twitter, Google verse that will then be applied 110% to gaming, whether there should be some distinctions or not. And the game industry representatives will, of course, argue that there are differences, and maybe they'll be able to establish some narrow differences, but pardon the pun, the game will be lost by then, which may be a good thing. I'm trying to be objective about this.
Also wondering, in response to, I think, one of the earlier questions, whether we sidestep the whole issue altogether when the industry moves on from loot boxes to some other, perhaps ethically questionable form of monetization. And then perhaps this all just goes away in its current form. But I mean, obviously then we need to think about the next thing. And I think the very valuable thing about your article is that it sets out a framework to help us think through not just loot boxes, but these different types of monetization techniques that, make use of all of these impulses that we all have.
I think from the conversation so far we've had, and also from reading your article, it is clear that loot boxes are not just some random isolated issue. It is a manifestation of what is wrong with this ubiquitous monetization practice that is specifically linked to a business model that is becoming predominant within the game industry. And based on that, my last question before we can have a look at some of the questions from the audience is, do you think or do you see the situation as a missed opportunity by the industry to react in a way that is a little bit more insightful and proactive, and perhaps rely on self-regulation, which they have done previously, especially when we look at age classifications? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that this could have been handled by the industry in a much better way?
I mean, so I was kind of reminded of the Super League saga that's going on right now, where there were Liverpool fans literally burning like Liverpool jerseys in front of Anfield, and I also feel like many of like the loot box incidents we have also should have been a clear sign that there's a corrupting force to the romantic idea of the gaming, of what gaming is about. And I think that also the Star Wars Battlefront 2 saga, it wasn't, I mean, there was some substance to it, because I think part of the issue people had with the loot box system in Star Wars Battlefront 2 was the fact that, if I remember correctly, the loot boxes weren't just there to give users aesthetic upgrades, but also upgrades that were actually literally better items in the game. And this was all seen as like a corrupting force to what video gaming is about, and of EA just trying to like optimize purchase patterns in its population, and just thought, well, we might as well experiment with better items. I mean, who knows? Maybe if we do some A/B testing, we can sell more and we make more money. And so I do think that these loot box sagas should really have been a cautionary tale, that there is, I mean, it's probably romantic speaking, there is something of value there that really can be lost. And so this response shouldn't be, how can we get around gambling legislation to make loot boxes like barely legal? So make X-ray pinatas instead of regular pinatas in Fortnite. But maybe think of, well, do we really want to have these, do we really want to build a game where we really try to just optimize engagement, where people enjoy the game just enough to keep playing, but also get annoyed because they don't spend enough money? And this is, of course, super idealistic and romantic, the romantic speaking, but yeah, that's how I feel about it at this particular moment. I don't think it's going to get better by self-regulation, but it should be a cautionary tale that you cannot just keep on inventing slightly different mechanisms. In the end, I guess there will be backlash.
I mean, it's also closely connected, of course, to the move to online video games, right, where you can have that constant adjustment to, to individual gamers and constant A/B testing. And I also think it's a bit naive, perhaps, to expect indeed from like self-regulation to do the trick, because it's really, you have they have all of this data available, and it's really, yeah, it's really putting, the cookie jar next to the Cookie Monster, right? Like, obviously, there's a race to the bottom, if you will, for the entire industry. So without clear rules, I don't think I'm not hopeful.
I mean, I like the romantic view, which is just make a good game and stop, make a proportionate amount of money and don't try anything too weird. I think Michaela Montagna has a great question in the Q&A, which is, it's just all a bigger, broader picture, which includes these kinds of monetizations and the questions around ethics, and then crunch practices within the video game industry. It all seems, obviously I haven't done the research, somebody needs to do it, but I think it feels quite all of a piece, which is why I'm slightly inclined to think that self-regulation, I think if there was a ship for self-regulation, I think the ship sailed some time ago.
I guess I just want to wrap this question up with two quick thoughts. One is that this is the time where there appears to be a lull. I think many of us have already suggested it's a false low, where the industry really needs to act on these things that they know about in order to not simply become a victim of what other larger regulation is put in place that may apply and should apply to the industry, but some of it shouldn't apply. So if the industry puts its house in order on some of these issues, particularly around gambling and children, this is the time, this is the opportunity to do it. And the opportunity won't last all that long, because eventually the turret will come around and be aimed back at the video game industry. The other thing is, and I say this somewhat facetiously, if someone in the audience has not been addicted to a game, it is worth the experiment to become addicted to a game to see how you feel about yourself. I've only become addicted to one game in my life. It happened to be an EA game. And I found myself buying things I didn't want. I mean, very much what Marjan and Jeff talk about in their paper happened to me 4 or 5 years ago. As an adult, as as someone who teaches this stuff, where I'm compelled at 2 in the morning to buy things I don't want, and spend way too much money on them. And it's really actually scary. So, people judge this stuff and say, oh, we don't need regulation. Well, go on the other side of that abyss. I'm not a particularly addictive personality. I've never gambled. I've gone to Vegas and have no problem just sitting at a sports book all day watching television and not even gambling a dollar. And yet I found myself addicted to a particular game at a particular time in my life. And it truly, as an adult in my early 60s or late 50s, and it was shockingly frightening to myself with my own level of awareness. Now, I probably didn't spend more than $500 to $1,000 on the game, but it was a freemium game. It was on my phone, and that's a lot. So, yeah, but before you say these aren't real issues, well, experiment with your own addictive threshold and see how you feel.
Well, thank you for that very personal confession, John. I'm conscious of the time. I still have lots of questions that I didn't have a chance to ask, but we also have questions from the audience. Some of them overlap a little bit, and I think question from Callum and Rushin is about, are loot boxes as such going away, or are they changing into a more acceptable monetization practice? Or as Rushin points out, is this more about awareness, public awareness and understanding? And I'm linking it back to the story of how the issue of loot boxes really started, which could be described as a series of bad corporate decisions that really upset and alienated the user community. And that's where the real kind of discontent arose from. So do you think that this is something that simply is going to be morphed into something more acceptable, or we will have to deal with a similar issue, but it's just going to be called something different, not a loot box, but something else?
I mean, I do think you can. So, for instance, I've played some Pokemon Go myself, and there are actually still loot boxes in Pokemon Go. They're just very well hidden in the game mechanism. So the mechanism of getting an egg that you have to hatch, and you have to buy an incubator to hatch the egg. And you don't know what's going to come out of the egg. That's just a loot box, but people don't recognize it as such. So I think we'll be naive to say that loot boxes are going to go away. There are just probably going to be better ways to hide them in the game, because it's still happening in Pokemon Go, and they've really actually upped their game. I also stopped playing it because it just became absolutely ridiculous. The different layers of different types of currencies that they introduced with different types of loot box mechanisms that weren't apparent as such. So I'm afraid I have to be cynical, and it's going to just stay but look different.
And do you think, as I think it was Kunal's comment, do you think that perhaps including a warning like you have with drinking or gambling, it's raising awareness, stop when the fun stops, would help?
I think one key insight from studies about what you could call manipulation is that transparency only goes so far, because what is so unique about manipulation is that it tries to get at particular vulnerabilities or weaknesses. And even if you're aware of the fact that it's happening, it can still get you, as the story that John just told us shows us. So I'm usually very cautious with saying, well, transparency will solve most of it, because the substance of the issue is that it probably won't, because they will probably get increasingly good at manipulating us, because there's just more user data and more abilities to experiment on our behavior.
Just to add some nuance to that, I completely agree to Marianne that obviously, like, just adding a warning, some user-facing disclosures are going to fix everything. That's a complete fiction, if you're asking me. But transparency does still have a vital role to play, when facing enforcement agencies, for instance, and that's one of the takeaways, or one of the recommendations we also make in the paper, is that consumer protection authorities, data protection authorities that admittedly have few limited resources, but they should really make use much more of their investigatory powers to really dig into this, and to sort of get over this fact that games that sort of like it's not really a problem, it's indeed just kids in their basement playing video games, like John was saying. So yeah, transparency does have a role to play, but we should not over focus on consumer facing transparency, but more regulator facing transparency.
Thank you all very much. I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to pick one last question that's very brief. Mayank is asking whether any of the panelists have played Disco Elysium, and if yes, what they think about it. You each have about 10 seconds if you do want to share your thoughts. I certainly haven't played.
I just want to say, bold of you to assume that an academic in the middle of a pandemic has time left to play games. I barely have time to feed myself or to water my plants. They're languishing. But no, I haven't. It's ironic that ever since I started this line of research, the time I have for playing games has decreased significantly.
Thank you very much. And John, go ahead.
I've made a note of the game. I will figure out what it is and play it and see where this leads.
Super.
And maybe I'll report back in our next seminar.
Absolutely. On that note, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for joining us tonight, to our audience, to their questions. I think we will store the questions and perhaps deal with them later in a sort of follow-up, just to make sure that we haven't missed anything given the limited time. Thank you so much. It's been great. And as I said, I still have lots of questions I haven't had a chance to ask you. And I'm hoping that everyone will read not just your article, but our whole upcoming issue 4.1 that looks at what we've been talking about today and beyond. Thank you.
I also want to invite people that still have open questions. Feel free to reach out, obviously. I'm sure you can find us, our contact details if you enter our names into your search engine of choice.